The autumn air hung heavy over Harlem on July 7, 1968, thick with grief and something else, anticipation, the kind of electric tension that crackles before lightning strikes. Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed godfather of Harlem's underworld, lay in his casket at the Unity Funeral Home on 7th Avenue, and the streets outside swelled with mourners. But this wasn't just any funeral. This was theater. This was politics. This was the changing of the guard in America's most notorious black neighborhood, and every player with skin in the game had come to witness what would happen next. Frank Lucas stood in that crowd, a lean wolf among the gathered pack, his mind calculating angles that no one else could see. He'd been Bumpy's driver, his confidant, his protégé for 15 years. He'd learned to read the old man's silences better than most men read words on a page. And Bumpy had taught him the most important lesson of all, that in this world, perception wasn't just reality, it was currency. What people believed about you determined whether you lived like a king or died like a dog in the gutter. The funeral home blazed with flowers, elaborate sprays and wreaths that must have cost fortunes. The Italian mob families had sent their tributes, the Lucases, the Genoveses, all the major players who'd done business with Bumpy over the decades. They stood in clusters near the walls, men in expensive suits with hard eyes, watching, always watching. These were people who understood the language of gesture, who could read volumes in a handshake or detect weakness in the angle of a man's shoulders. Frank had arrived early that morning, before most of the crowd assembled, before the photographers and reporters took their positions outside. He'd come with something no one expected, something that would be talked about in whispers in barrooms for decades to come. Draped across his arm was a full-length chinchilla coat, custom-made, worth more than most of these mourners made in 5 years. But it wasn't for him. It was for Bumpy. The old man lay in his coffin wearing a simple dark suit, dignified but understated, exactly as his widow Ruth had arranged. Frank approached the casket with the coat, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that made people step aside without realizing why. He didn't ask permission, didn't seek approval from Ruth or anyone else in the family. He simply unfolded that magnificent coat and draped it over Bumpy's body, covering him from chest to feet in luxury that seemed to glow even in the funeral home's subdued lighting. The room went silent. You could hear the rustle of that chinchilla, the whisper of fur against silk. Frank stepped back, and every eye in that room fixed on him. The Italians stopped their murmured conversations. The Harlem numbers runners and street soldiers straightened their spines. Even Ruth Johnson, consumed by her grief, looked up with an expression caught between shock and something that might have been understanding, but Frank wasn't done. From his inside pocket he produced an envelope, thick, substantial, the kind of envelope that meant business. He placed it in the coffin, tucked it beside Bumpy's folded hands, and those who stood close enough could see the green edges of $100 bills packed tight inside. Later the stories would vary. Some said there was $50,000 in that envelope. Others claimed 75. The most persistent rumors, the ones that stuck and spread through the underworld like fire through dry grass, put the figure at $100,000 in cash. $100,000. In 1968, that wasn't just money. It was a statement carved in granite. It was more than most men would see in a lifetime of honest work. It was enough to buy 3 houses in a good neighborhood, or 50 Cadillacs, or the kind of firepower that could start a small war, and Frank Lucas had just placed it in a dead man's coffin, to be buried in the ground where it would serve no earthly purpose except one, to demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt that Frank Lucas had arrived. The symbolism crashed through that funeral home like a wrecking ball through cheap drywall. In the criminal underworld, where men lived and died by unwritten codes, where respect was the only currency that truly mattered, Frank had just announced his intentions to everyone who mattered. He wasn't just mourning his mentor, he was claiming inheritance. He was telling the Italians, the other Harlem bosses, the police who inevitably had informants in the crowd, that the chinchilla throne didn't die with Bumpy Johnson, It had merely been passed to new hands. The Italian mobsters understood immediately. You could see it in their faces, the subtle shift in their expressions from curiosity to calculation. They'd done business with Bumpy because he was reliable, because he kept Harlem's drug trade organized and profitable, because he understood that certain boundaries existed and wouldn't be crossed. But Bumpy was old school, a product of the Prohibition era, a man who'd learned the game when the Italians controlled everything that mattered. Frank Lucas was something different. Frank was young, ambitious, and apparently had access to the kind of capital that suggested either extraordinary success or extraordinary recklessness. Nicky Barnes stood near the back of the room, already a rising figure in Harlem's heroin trade, already starting to build his own empire. He watched Frank's performance with narrowed eyes, recognizing both the brilliance and the danger of what he was witnessing. Barnes understood street theater. He'd later become famous for his own displays of outrageous wealth and power. But even Barnes, who would eventually grace the cover of the New York Times Magazine as Mr. Untouchable, had to admit that Frank's move was something special. It was bold to the point of audacity, and in their world, audacity often SIPA. Raided the legends from the corpses, or the whispers started before Frank even returned to his seat. Old-timers who'd known Bumpy since the 1930s muttered to each other, trying to make sense of this unexpected development. Bumpy had other lieutenants, other men who'd worked for him, some for even longer than Frank. Why hadn't any of them made such a gesture? Did they lack the money, the imagination, or did they simply understand something that Frank didn't? That such displays attracted attention, and attention in their business was usually the prelude to destruction? Brr. But Frank had calculated the odds differently. He'd spent 15 years watching Bumpy navigate the treacherous waters between Harlem's street-level operators and the Italian families who controlled the broader drug distribution networks. He'd seen how Bumpy maintained his power not just through violence, though violence was always there, lurking like a loaded gun in a drawer, but through the careful management of his reputation. Bumpy was respected because people believed he had power. The reality of that power was almost secondary to the belief itself, and now Frank was engineering his own mythology in real time, right there over Bumpy's corpse. Every mobster in that room would carry the story of this funeral out into the streets. They'd tell their associates, who'd tell their runners, who'd tell the dealers on the corners, and within days the legend would have spread through every borough of New York out to New Jersey. EY and Philadelphia and Boston, anywhere that men traded in the particular currency of criminal reputation. They'd say that Frank Lucas had buried $100 grand with Bumpy Johnson. They'd say he did it without flinching, without hesitation, with the kind of casual disregard for money that suggested he had access to rivers of it. And in a business where trust was impossible and fear was just another tool, where your competitors were constantly probing for weakness and the police were always looking for the angle that would bring you down, that kind of reputation was worth more than the $100,000 it cost to create it, because the story would make other dealers think twice before crossing him. It would make suppliers believe he was serious, substantial, worth doing business with. It would make the Italians reconsider their assumption that Harlem's drug trade would fracture into chaos after Bumpy's death, dissolving into a dozen small-time operations they could pick off or absorb as they saw fit. Frank knew something else, too, something that gave his gesture an additional layer of meaning that most people in that room couldn't fully appreciate. He knew that the money in that envelope wasn't really being buried. Oh, it would go into the ground with Bumpy's body, sure enough. But money is never just money in the criminal world. It's a marker, a promise, a threat, a message. The physical bills would rot in the earth, but the idea of those bills would circulate forth, growing in value with each retelling, accruing interest in the form of respect and fear and curiosity. The funeral proceeded. The Reverend delivered his eulogy, painting Bumpy as a complicated man who'd been both sinner and saint, both protector and predator, a man who'd fed hungry families and broken the bones of those who crossed him. It was the kind of moral ambiguity that Harlem had long since made peace with. In a neighborhood where legitimate opportunity was strangled by racism and economic abandonment, where black men were systematically denied access to the legal paths to prosperity that white America took for granted, the criminal class served a complex function. They were parasites, yes, but they were also providers, employers, and in their own twisted way, community leaders. Bumpy had understood this duality and used it to build his empire. He'd paid for funerals, bailed families out of financial disasters, made sure certain widows got envelopes at Christmas time. He'd also ordered murders, overseen brutal beatings, and pumped poison into the veins of Harlem's most vulnerable citizens. Both things were true simultaneously, and the neighborhood had learned to hold both truths in tension, to accept that the devil they knew was often preferable to the devils who might replace him. Now Frank was positioning himself as Bumpy's successor in this morally complicated role, and the chinchilla coat was his coronation robe. When the service ended and the pallbearers lifted, Bumpy's casket, that coat still draped over it, that envelope still tucked inside, Frank fell in behind them. He didn't position himself at the front with the family, didn't overreach in his claim. He walked in that careful middle ground, close enough to demonstrate his importance, far enough back to show respect for blood relations and hierarchy. Even in his moment of bold gesture, he displayed the kind of strategic thinking that had kept him alive and successful for so many years. Outside, 7th Avenue was jammed with people. Thousands had come to pay their respects to Bumpy, the streets filled with the kind of crowd usually reserved for championship parades or civil rights marches. Police cruisers lined the blocks, officers watching nervously, knowing that this concentration of criminal power represented both danger and opportunity. Detectives with cameras photographed everyone entering and leaving the funeral home, building files, documenting associations, looking for the connections that might eventually bring down the whole rotten structure. Frank walked through that crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. The story of the coat and the money had already leaked out, carried by the funeral home staff and the early arrivals who'd witnessed his gesture. People pointed and whispered as he passed. Some faces showed respect. Others displayed naked envy. A few registered calculation, the mental machinery already turning over the question of how to exploit this new player's obview. Wealth and ambition. The Italian mobsters emerged in their own procession, moving to their Lincoln Continentals and Cadillac. Fleetwoods, with the smooth coordination of men accustomed to operating as a unit. But several of them paused, making eye contact with Frank across the crowd. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. They'd received his message. Now began the delicate process of determining what it meant for their operations, their profits, their carefully balanced arrangements with Harlem's criminal infrastructure. The ride to the cemetery stretched through Harlem like a river of grief and power, a slow-moving motorcade that transformed the neighborhood's streets into a stage for one of the most significant transitions in the history of American organized crime. Frank Lucas sat in the back of a black Cadillac, 3 cars behind the hearse, watching the crowds that lined the sidewalks, old women in church hats, young men in sharkskin suits, children pulled by their mothers' hands, staring with wide eyes at the spectacle passing before them. They were witnessing history, though most of them didn't realize it yet. They were watching the old order being buried and the new order announcing itself with a $100,000 megaphone. Frank's mind wasn't on Bumpy's corpse or the chinchilla coat that had already become legend. His thoughts raced ahead, calculating the next moves in a game that had just become exponentially more dangerous and potentially more profitable than it had been 24 hours earlier. The funeral gesture had been the opening salvo, the attention-grabbing headline. Now came the hard part, delivering on the promise that gesture implied, because in the criminal underworld, reputation without substance was just a fancy way of painting a target on your back. He thought about the years he'd spent watching Bumpy work, absorbing lessons that the old man had taught both explicitly and through demonstration. The most important lesson wasn't about violence or intimidation, though Bumpy had been expert at both. It wasn't even about the mechanics of the drug trade. the logistics of moving product through the city's veins. The crucial lesson was about understanding the ecosystem in which they operated, the delicate balance of power between the black street operators and the Italian families who controlled the wholesale heroin supply, the intricate dance with police corruption that kept certain people protected while others got sacrificed to maintain the illusion of law enforcement effectiveness. Bumpy had survived for decades in a business where most men died or went to prison within 5 years because he understood that the drug trade wasn't really about drugs. It was about relationships, about knowing who to pay and how much, about understanding which cops could be bought and which ones were true believers who'd lock up their own mothers if it meant a headline. It was about recognizing that the Italians who supplied the heroin viewed black dealers as necessary but ultimately disposable middlemen, useful for handling the street-level distribution in neighborhoods where Italian faces would stand out, but not deserving of equal partnership or genuine respect. That last point gnawed at Frank more than he'd ever admitted to Bumpy. The old man had made his peace with subordination, had accepted that in the broader criminal hierarchy, black operators would always occupy a lower tier than their white counterparts. But Frank couldn't accept it. The chinchilla coat and the buried money were the opening moves in a longer campaign to change that fundamental dynamic, to prove that a black man from North Carolina who'd started with nothing could compete at the highest levels of the international drug trade. The cemetery gates appeared ahead, wrought iron and stone announcing the threshold between the living city and the city of the dead. Frank had been to plenty of funerals, occupational hazard in his line of work, but this one felt different. Weight pressed on his chest, not grief exactly, though he genuinely cared about Bumpy, but something more like the physical sensation of destiny asserting itself. His life was dividing into before and after, and the dividing line ran right through this moment, this day, this elaborately choreographed demonstration of wealth and ambition. The hearse pulled to a stop near the prepared gravesite, and the crowd that had followed from the funeral home spread across the Manny. Cured grass like a dark stain, Frank emerged from his Cadillac, automatically scanning faces, identifying allies and potential threats, cataloging who was present and, perhaps more importantly, who was absent. Some of Bumpy's old associates had stayed away, and their absence spoke volumes. They were either too afraid to be photographed at a high-profile criminal funeral, or they were already making their own moves to fill a power vacuum, positioning themselves as alternatives to Frank's presumed succession. The graveside service was brief. The Reverend spoke about dust and ashes, about eternal rest, about souls and salvation. Frank barely heard the words. His attention was fixed on a cluster of men standing slightly apart from the main crowd, Italians from the Lucchese family, 3 of them, dressed in black suits that probably cost more than most of these mourners earned in a year. The one in the middle, a heavy-set man with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of black ice, was Antonio Tony Gigante, a capo who'd been one of Bumpy's main points of contact with the Italian wholesale heroin network. Tony was watching Frank with the expression of a man trying to solve a complex equation. Frank met his gaze and held it, not aggressive but not deferential either. This was a crucial moment, a silent negotiation conducted entirely through eye contact and body language. Frank was signaling that he expected to step into Bumpy's role, to maintain the business relationships the old man had cultivated. Tony's response would determine whether that transition happened smoothly or whether Frank would have to fight for every inch of ground. Tony's expression didn't change, but after a long moment, he gave a barely perceptible nod. Not approval exactly, more like acknowledgement. "We'll see," that nod said. "You've made your statement. Now let's see if you can back it up." The casket was lowered into the ground, that chinchilla coat still draped over it, and Frank felt the finality of it in his bones. There was no going back now. He'd committed himself publicly, spectacularly. Every major player in New York's criminal underworld now knew his name and had formed an opinion about his character based on that single gesture. Some would see strength and decisiveness, others would see recklessness and poor judgment. Which interpretation prevailed would depend entirely on what Frank did next. As mourners began throwing handfuls of earth onto the casket, Frank noticed a face in the crowd that sent a cold spike of adrenaline through his system. Detective Richie Roberts stood near a tree about 50 yards away, making no effort to conceal his presence. Roberts was NYPD, a detective in the Narcotics Bureau, and he had a reputation as one of the few truly incorruptible cops in a department where corruption was as common as coffee. Stories circulated about Roberts, about the time he'd found nearly $1 million in unmarked bills in a drug dealer's car and turned in every penny. Instead of pocketing it like 99% of cops would have done, Roberts was watching the funeral with the intense focus of a man who understood he was witnessing something significant. He'd have seen the coat, heard about the money by now. He'd be wondering where Frank Lucas got that kind of cash, what it signified, whether this was the beginning of a new criminal organization that would need to be investigated, infiltrated, and ultimately destroyed. Frank didn't look away from Roberts. Let the cop stare, let him wonder. One of the advantages of operating in the criminal underworld was that the police worked under rules and restrictions that didn't apply to people like Frank. Roberts would need warrants, probable cause, informants who were willing to testify. He'd need to build cases that would stand up in court, convince prosecutors, navigate departmental politics. Frank just needed to move product and avoid stupid mistakes, but Roberts represented a danger that Frank couldn't entirely dismiss. Most cops could be handled, bought off, intimidated, redirected toward easier targets. Roberts was different. True believers were always more dangerous than the corrupt ones because you couldn't predict their behavior, couldn't rely on self-interest to guide their decisions. Roberts would go after Frank not for money or career advancement, but because he genuinely believed in the law, and that made him both admirable and terrifying in roughly equal measure. The crowd began to disperse as the graveside service concluded. Frank lingered, ostensibly paying final respects but actually giving the Italian mobsters time to approach him if they chose to. It was a calculated risk. Seeming too eager to establish contact with the Italians could make him look desperate, but ignoring them entirely might be interpreted as disrespect or naivety about the realities of how their business functioned. Tony Gigante made the decision for him. The capo detached himself from his companions and walked over with the measured stride of a man who feared nothing because he'd survived everything. Up close, Tony looked older than he had from a distance, his face carved with lines that told stories of violence and survival, of deals made and broken, of bodies buried in shallow graves and fortunes won and lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. That was quite a gesture, Tony said, his voice carrying the rough edge of a lifetime of cigarettes and whiskey. Bumpy was lucky to have such a devoted friend. Frank heard the subtext beneath the words. Tony wasn't complimenting him on his loyalty. He was probing, trying to determine if Frank understood the deeper implications of what he'd done. The money wasn't just money. The coat wasn't just a coat. They were claims, declarations, announcements of intent that would reverberate through the entire criminal ecosystem. Bumpy taught me everything, Frank replied, keeping his voice neutral but firm. Taught me about respect, about keeping your word, about the importance of strong relationships in this business. Tony smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Business is about to get complicated, Frank. Bumpy kept things stable in Harlem, kept the peace between the different crews, made sure the product flowed smoothly. People are going to be looking at you now, wondering if you can do the same, wondering if that $100,000 in the ground is money you can afford to throw away, or if it's the last of your capital that you just spent on theater. It's not the last, Frank said, meeting Tony's eyes directly. Not even close. Tony studied him for a long moment, and Frank could feel the weight of that assessment. The decades of experience that Tony brought to bear in reading men, determining who was strong and who was weak, who would survive and who would end up in a grave just like Bumpy's. Finally, Tony nodded. "We'll be in touch," he said. "But Frank, don't make the mistake of thinking that coat and that money bought you anything except attention. In our business, attention is a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways. Tony walked away, rejoining his companions, and Frank watched them go with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. The conversation had gone about as well as he could have hoped. Tony hadn't dismissed him, hadn't laughed at his presumption. But the warning was clear. The Italians would be watching closely, waiting to see if Frank could deliver on the promise of competence and profitability that his funeral display had implied. The rest of the mourners were streaming toward their cars now, the machinery of grief and ceremony winding down. Frank spotted Nicky Barnes near the cemetery entrance talking with two men Frank didn't recognize. Barnes glanced over and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Barnes smiled, but it was the smile of a shark spotting blood in the water. Barnes was ambitious too, had his own dreams of empire, and Frank's move at the funeral hadn't gone unnoticed by his potential rival. Competition was inevitable in their business. Too many hungry men chasing the same finite pool of drug money. But Frank had just raised the stakes considerably. He'd announced himself as a major player, and that meant Barnes and every other operator in Harlem would now be measuring themselves against him, looking for openings to exploit, weaknesses to attack. The funeral gesture had bought Frank respect and fear in roughly equal measure, but it had also painted a target on his back that would remain there for as long as he stayed in the game. Frank walked slowly back to his Cadillac, very aware of the eyes tracking his movement. Detective Roberts was still there, still watching, probably making mental notes that would end up in a file somewhere, building the foundation of what would eventually become an investigation. Let him watch. Let him note. The thing Roberts didn't understand, the thing that separated cops from criminals in Frank's men, was that cops played defense. They reacted to what criminals did, always one step behind, always trying to catch up. Criminals played offense. They initiated action, created chaos, moved fast, and struck hard before the slow machinery of law enforcement could respond. He reached his car and paused with his hand on the door, looking back at the gravesite one last time. Workers were already starting to shovel earth into the hole, and within an hour Bumpy would be completely buried, that chinchilla coat and those $100 bills sealed in the ground forever. But the legend of it would live on, growing with each retelling, becoming part of the mythology of American crime. Frank had learned from Bumpy that in their world, mythology mattered as much as reality. The stories people told about you determined your value, your power, your survival. And Frank had just given them one hell of a story to tell. Now came the hard part, living up to it. The week after Bumpy's funeral, Frank Lucas's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Word had spread through Harlem faster than fire through dry timber. The story of the chinchilla coat and the buried money mutating and expanding with each retelling until some versions had Frank burying $250,000, $500,000, amounts so extravagant they crossed the line from impressive into absurd. But even the conservative estimates, the ones that stuck closest to the truth, were enough to establish Frank as a figure of genuine importance in the criminal landscape of 1968 New York. Frank operated from a modest apartment on West 114th Street, deliberately understated in contrast to his funeral display. The apartment was clean but not luxurious, furnished with simple furniture that wouldn't attract attention from neighbors or police. One of Bumpy's lessons had been about the difference between power and the appearance of power. You needed both, but you had to be strategic about when and where you displayed which. The funeral had been the moment for spectacle. Now was the moment for careful, quiet work. The calls came from all directions. Small-time dealers who'd worked with Bumpy wanted to know if their arrangements would continue. Numbers runners needed reassurance that their protection would remain in place. Even a few legitimate businessmen, or as legitimate as anyone got in Harlem, reached out, men who'd paid Bumpy for various services ranging from dispute resolution to muscle for collecting bad debts. They all wanted the same thing, confirmation that Frank was really stepping into Bumpy's shoes, that the power structure they'd come to rely on wasn't going to collapse into chaos and violence. Frank took the calls patiently, saying little but listening carefully to every word. This was intelligence gathering, the crucial process of mapping the territory he was claiming. Who was loyal? Who was ambitious? Who could be trusted and who would turn on him the moment it became profitable? Bumpy had maintained detailed menta Bell files on everyone in his network, and Frank had paid attention during those long hours of driving the old man around, listening to him talk about the chess game of criminal enterprise. But the most important call came on Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the funeral. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, clipped, and professional, delivering a message with the efficiency of a telegram. Mr. Gigante would like to meet. Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. A restaurant in Little Italy, address to follow. Frank hung up and sat in the silence of his apartment, feeling the weight of what that invitation meant. The Italians didn't invite black dealers to sit-down meetings in their own territory. That kind of gesture suggested either genuine interest in doing serious business or a setup for violence. Frank had to assume it could be both simultaneously and prepare accordingly. He spent the next day and a half making arrangements. First, he reached out to his most trusted associates, men who'd been loyal to Bumpy and who'd indicated their willingness to transfer that loyalty to Frank. He told them where he'd be and when, gave them positions to watch from, made sure that if the meeting went sideways, there would be witnesses and potentially backup. It was inadequate protection if the Italians really wanted him dead, but it was better than walking in completely exposed. Second, he went shopping. The suit he'd worn to Bumpy's funeral was fine for grief and graveyards, but a meeting with Italian mobsters required something different. He visited a tailor in Midtown, a small shop that catered to men who valued discretion and quality in equal measure. The suit he commissioned was charcoal gray, hand-stitched, fitted so precisely it felt like a second skin. The shirt was silk, the tie was imported, and the shoes were Italian leather that probably cost more than his first car. The tailor, an elderly Jewish man named Saul who'd been dressing criminals and businessmen for 40 years, looked at Frank with knowing eyes as he measured the inseam. "Big meeting?" he asked. "Important one," Frank replied. Saul nodded, pins held between his lips. "Let me tell you something I've learned from dressing men like you. The suit doesn't make you powerful, but it tells people you already know you're powerful. That's the difference between looking like you're trying too hard and looking like you were born to the role." Frank thought about that as Saul worked, recognizing the truth in it. The funeral display had been deliberately ostentatious because it needed to grab attention to force people to notice him. But this meeting required something different, understated confidence, the appearance of a man who belonged in rooms with powerful people because power recognized its own. Friday night arrived cold and clear, the November air biting with the promise of winter. Frank dressed carefully, checking his appearance in the mirror with the scrutiny of a general inspecting his armor before battle. The suit fit perfectly, transforming him from a street operator into something that could pass for a legitimate businessman. He looked at his reflection and barely recognized the man staring back. Not the kid from North Carolina who'd arrived in Harlem with nothing, not even the driver and enforcer who'd worked for Bumpy for 15 years. This was someone new, someone being born in real time from ambition and opportunity and the kind of calculated risk that separated legends from statistics. The restaurant was called Il Paradiso, and it occupied a corner lot in Little Italy that probably hadn't changed much since the 1920s. Frank arrived exactly on time, not early, which would suggest anxiety, and not late, which would suggest disrespect or poor time management. He walked through the front door into an atmosphere thick with the smell of garlic and tomatoes and roasting meat, the tables filled with families and couples enjoying their Friday night dinners. But Frank wasn't there for the dining room. A man in a dark suit materialized at his elbow, spoke no words, simply gestured toward a door at the back. Frank followed, very aware of the weight of eyes on him, of the attention his presence was generating. A black man in Little Italy was unusual enough. A black man being escorted to the back rooms where real business happened was practically unprecedented. The back room was smaller than he'd expected, dominated by a large round table where Tony Gigante sat with their men. Frank recognized one of them, Vincent the Chin Gigante, Tony's cousin, a made man in the Genovese family with a reputation for violence so extreme it was whispered about even in circles where violence was routine. The other two were unfamiliar, but their presence and positioning suggested they were significant players in the Italian mob hierarchy. "Frank," Tony said, gesturing to an empty chair, "sit. You want something to eat? The veal here is excellent." Frank sat but declined the food. Eating would be a distraction, and he needed all his focus for whatever was about to happen. The men around the table studied him with the frank appraisal of buyers examining merchandise, looking for flaws, assessing value. "You made quite an impression at Bumpy's funeral," Tony continued, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. $100,000 in the ground. That's either the act of a very wealthy man or a very stupid one. Which are you, Frank? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. This was the moment where Frank's entire future would be determined by the words he chose and the confidence with which he delivered them. He'd prepared for this, had rehearsed various responses, but now that the moment was here, he abandoned the script and spoke from instinct. "Neither," Frank said. "I'm a man who understands that in this business reputation is capital. You can't spend reputation on fancy cars or expensive suits, but reputation buys you things money can't. Respect. Fear, the belief that you're capable of backing up whatever claims you make. Bumpy taught me that. The money in the ground wasn't waste. It was investment." Vincent, the chin, leaned forward, his heavy-lidded eyes fixed on Frank with predatory intensity. "Investment in what exactly?" "In making sure that everyone who matters in this city knows I'm serious about stepping into Bumpy's role. That I have the resources, the vision, and the balls to operate at the level he operated at. Maybe higher." That last part was deliberate provocation, testing how much confidence these men would tolerate from a black dealer who was theoretically their subordinate in the broader criminal hierarchy. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger exactly, more like interest. Like a cat that had just noticed a mouse with unusually sharp teeth. Tony spoke again, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Bumpy kept Harlem organized. He made sure the product flowed smoothly, made sure the different crews didn't tear each other apart fighting over territory. He understood his place in the larger structure and respected it. Can you do the same?" Here was the real question, the actual purpose of this meeting. The Italians weren't interested in Frank's ambition or his funeral gestures. They wanted to know if he would maintain the status quo, if he would continue buying their heroin at their prices, if he would accept his role as a valuable but ultimately subordinate partner in their empire. Frank had known this question was coming and had decided hours ago how he would answer it. The safe response would be to agree, to promise continuity, to position himself as Bumpy's faithful successor who would change nothing of substance. That answer would probably get him out of this room alive, and with the Italian's blessing to continue operations. It would also lock him into the same subordinate position Bumpy had occupied, forever dependent on Italian suppliers, forever operating at their sufferance. "I can keep Harlem organized," Frank said carefully. "I can make sure the product flows and the money comes in clean, but I think the business model needs to evolve. We're leaving money on the table with the current arrangement." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The two men Frank didn't know exchanged glances. Vincent's jaw tightened. Even Tony, who'd been relatively friendly up to this point, went very still in the way that dangerous men do right before they commit violence. "Explain," Tony said, the single word carrying more menace than most threats. Frank took a breath, knowing he was walking a razor's edge between opportunity and disaster. "The current system has 5-6 levels between the poppy fields in Southeast Asia and the users in Harlem. Each level adds cost and risk. By the time the heroin gets to us, it's been cut and recut, marked up over and over, and we're paying premium prices for a diluted product. What if we eliminated some of those levels?" "You mean cut us out," Vincent said flatly. "No," Frank replied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I mean partner differently. I have contacts, resources that could potentially source product more directly. Better quality, lower cost, higher profits for everyone involved, but it would require a different kind of arrangement than the traditional supplier-distributor model." The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours. Frank could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat forming under the expensive suit, despite the room's cool temperature. He just proposed something that was either brilliant or suicidal, and which category it fell into would be determined by the men staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely controlled rage. Tony broke the silence. "Frank, do you know how many people have sat in that chair and proposed revolutionary changes to how our business operates? Do you know how many of them are still alive?" "I can imagine," Frank said, "but most of them probably didn't have what I have." "Which is?" "Connections in Southeast Asia, military connections, routes and contacts that can move product from Thailand and Vietnam directly to New York, bypassing all the traditional middlemen, and the capital to fund the first shipment to prove the concept." This was the gamble, the real reason for the $100,000 in Bumpy's grave. Frank had been building toward this moment for years, carefully cultivating relationships with military personnel who rotated through Southeast Asia, learning about the logistics of moving contraband through military supply chains, understanding that the chaos of the Vietnam War had created opportunities that wouldn't exist in peacetime. The funeral display had been about establishing his credibility, making the Italians believe he had the resources to back up whatever proposals he made. Tony and Vincent conferred in rapid Italian, their voices too low for Frank to make out the words, even if he'd understood the language. The other two men remained silent, watching Frank with the intensity of people evaluating a potentially dangerous animal. Finally, Tony turned back to him. "Bar, this is not a decision we make tonight," Tony said. "What you're proposing would require buy-in from people way above our level. But I'll tell you what, you bring us a sample. Show us this product you claim you can source. If it's as good as you say, if the economics work the way you claim, then maybe we have a conversation. But Frank, if you're running a game, if this is some scheme to take our money or cut us out, you won't end up in a grave with a chinchilla coat. You'll end up in pieces in the East River, understand?" "I understand," Frank said. "Be good. Now get the fuck out of here and don't come back until you have something real to show us." Frank stood, nodded to the men around the table, and walked out of the back room with as much dignity as he could muster while his legs felt like water. He made it through the restaurant, out the front door, and half a block down the street before he let himself stop and breathe. His hands were shaking, adrenaline crash hitting him hard now that the immediate danger had passed. But beneath the fear was something else, exhilaration. He'd walked into the lion's den and walked out alive. More than that, he'd walked out with something like conditional approval for a plan that would, if it worked, revolutionize the heroin trade and make him independently wealthy beyond anything Bumpy had ever achieved. The Italians hadn't laughed at him, hadn't dismissed him. They'd given him enough rope to either pull himself up or hang himself with, and Frank would take those odds any day. The next 6 months were a controlled sprint through a minefield, every step calculated, every decision potentially fatal. Frank Lucas had made promises to the Italians that he now had to fulfill, and the gap between promise and delivery was filled with logistics so complex they made his head hurt when he thought about them for too long. But Frank didn't let himself think too long about any one problem. He'd learned from Bumpy that, in their business, paralysis was more dangerous than making the wrong decision quickly. His connection to the military supply chain had started years earlier, back when he was still driving for Bumpy. A cousin of Frank's, Leslie, Ike Atkinson, had enlisted in the Army and ended up stationed in Bangkok and later Saigon, working in supply and logistics. Ike was smart, ambitious, and fundamentally unmoved by the moral complexities of the war he'd been sent to fight. When Frank first floated the idea of using military transport to move heroin, Ike hadn't blinked. "Half the fucking army is high over here anyway," Ike had said during one of their carefully coded phone conversations. "Heroin is everywhere, cheaper than beer, purer than anything stateside. The military moves thousands of pounds of equipment and supplies every day. You think anyone's checking every crate that comes through? It's chaos, Frank. Beautiful, profitable chaos, but turning that chaos into a reliable smuggling operation required more than just Ike's access and willingness. It required building a network of corrupt officials, paying off the right people, establishing connections with the hill tribe farmers in the Golden Triangle who actually grew the opium poppies. It required capital, significant capital, for the first major purchase, for bribes, for establishing the infrastructure that would make regular shipments possible. The $100,000 buried with Bumpy hadn't been Frank's last reserves, but it had put a significant dent in his liquid capital. He needed to generate cash fast, which meant running his Harlem operations harder than ever while simultaneously planning for the much larger operation that would either make him a legend or get him killed. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping 4 hours a night when he slept at all, moving between meetings with street dealers, sessions with his accounting people who tracked the money flows, and careful conversations with the various players who made up his emerging organization. Nicky Barnes watched Frank's frantic activity with the interest of a rival who couldn't decide whether to view him as competition or opportunity. Barnes had his own operation running, his own connections and distribution networks, and in another timeline they might have ended up in a shooting war over territory and market share. But both men were smart enough to recognize that Harlem could support multiple major operations if they didn't tear each other apart fighting. They established a wary détente, not quite allies but not quite enemies, each watching the other for signs of weakness or betrayal. 3 months after the meeting in Little Italy, Frank made his first trip to Thailand. He traveled under a legitimate business cover, supposedly investigating import opportunities for a clothing company that existed only on paper. The trip was a revelation. Southeast Asia in 1968 was a region transformed by war, where the normal rules of commerce and society had been suspended in favor of chaos and opportunity. American military bases sprawled across the landscape, displacing traditional communities, pumping billions of dollars into local economies, creating boomtown conditions where anything could be bought if you had the money and the connections. Bangkok felt like a fever dream, the heat and humidity so intense it was like breathing through a wet blanket, the streets packed with American servicemen on leave, spending their combat pay on alcohol, sex, and drugs, with the desperate enthusiasm of men who knew they might be dead in a week. Frank moved through this chaos with Ike as his guide, meeting the people who would become crucial nodes in his smuggling network. There was Luchai, a Thai businessman with connections to the police and military who could facilitate the movement of heroin from the countryside to Bangkok. There was Colonel Pham, a South Vietnamese officer who controlled certain sections of the military supply routes and who was entirely willing to look the other way if the price was right. And most importantly, there was a Chinese middleman known only as Mr. Lee, who had direct connections to the opium producers in the Golden Triangle and could supply heroin of a purity that Frank had never seen in the States. The sample Mr. Lee showed him was almost 98% pure, a white powder so potent that a tiny amount could kill an experienced user who'd built up tolerance to the stepped-on garbage that circulated on American streets. Frank held that sample in his hand and understood he was looking at a product that would revolutionize the New York market. Once cut down to street-level purity, this single kilogram could be turned into 50 or 60 kilograms of saleable PR. Oh, duct. The profit margins were almost obscene, but getting it back to New York was the challenge that kept Frank awake at night. Ike had worked out a system using military coffins. The bodies of servicemen killed in Vietnam were being shipped home regularly, and with the right paperwork and the right bribes, additional weight in those coffins would go unnoticed. It was ghoulish, using the corpses of American soldiers as drug mules, but Frank had long ago made peace with the moral compromises required by his chosen profession. The logistics were intricate. The heroin would be packaged in waterproof bundles and placed in the coffins alongside the bodies. Ike and his network of corrupted supply personnel would handle the paperwork ensuring those particular coffins ended up on flights to specific military bases on the East Coast. From there, Frank's people would intercept the shipments before they reached the families of the deceased, extract the drugs, and deliver the coffins to their intended destinations with no one the wiser. It was audacious. It was risky. It was also essentially foolproof if executed correctly, because who was going to inspect a coffin containing a dead American hero? The military wanted those bodies home and buried as quickly as possible, wanted to minimize the exposure of America's death toll in an increasingly unpopular war. The very mechanisms of grief and patriotism that surrounded the war dead would provide cover for Frank's operation. The first test, shipment, went through in May 1969, almost a year after Bumpy's funeral. Frank didn't sleep for 3 days while that coffin made its way across the Pacific, through customs, through military processing, and finally to a funeral home in New Jersey, where one of Frank's trusted lieutenants worked as a night supervisor. When the call came that they'd successfully extracted 10 kilograms of pure heroin, Frank allowed himself a single glass of cognac and 5 minutes of satisfaction before his mind shifted to the next challenge, getting this product to the Italians and proving his concept. He called Tony Gigante and arranged another meeting, this time in a different location, a social club in Brooklyn where the Lucchese family did business. Frank brought a sample of the heroin, 1 kilogram in a plain brown package, and he brought something else, detailed financial projections showing what this arrangement could mean in terms of profit. The Italians tested the heroin, and Frank watched their expressions change from skepticism to surprise to something like respect. This wasn't the 40% pure garbage they'd been getting through their traditional Turkish and French suppliers. This was pharmaceutical grade, product that would allow them to cut it more extensively, generate more profit per kilogram, and dominate the market through sheer quality superiority. "Where the fuck did you get this?" Vincent the Chin asked. And for the first time since Frank had met him, Vincent sounded impressed rather than threatening. "I have my sources," Frank replied, "and I can deliver this consistently in quantity for a price point that's 30% below what you're currently paying your other suppliers." The negotiations that followed were intense and complex, conducted over several meetings across several weeks. The Italians wanted control, they always wanted control, but Frank held firm on certain points. He would maintain ownership of the product until it reached New York, would handle the importation and initial distribution, would operate as a genuine partner rather than just another black street dealer buying wholesale and selling retail in the ghetto. The final arrangement they reached was unprecedented in the history of New York drug trafficking. Frank would import the heroin directly from Southeast Asia, using his military connections and smuggling networks. He would sell to the Italian families at a price point that was attractive to them while still generating enormous profits for himself. But he would also maintain his own distribution network in Harlem, operating semi-independently rather than as a subordinate to Italian control. The Italians would handle their own territories and Frank would handle his, and both sides would profit from access to higher quality product at lower prices. It was a delicate balance requiring constant management and negotiation, but it worked because everyone was making more money than they'd made before. Frank's profit margins on the first few major shipments were astronomical, single runs that generated more income than Bumpy had made in years of operations. The money flooded in so fast that Frank's main problem became finding ways to launder it, to convert it from bricks of cash into legitimate-looking assets that wouldn't immediately attract attention from law enforcement. By late 1969, Frank Lucas was operating the largest heroin importing operation in the United States, moving product worth millions of dollars annually, employing dozens of people in a complex organization that spanned from Thai poppy fields to New York street corners. The funeral gesture that had seemed so extravagant had paid for itself many times over, establishing Frank's reputation as a serious player and opening doors that would have remained closed to just another ambitious dealer. But success brought its own dangers. The more successful Frank became, the more visible he became, and visibility in the drug trade was usually the prelude to destruction. Detective Richie Roberts hadn't forgotten about the funeral, hadn't stopped investigating, and he was slowly assembling evidence that would eventually threaten everything Frank had built. Other dealers envied Frank's success and looked for ways to undermine him or steal his connections. The Italians, while currently cooperative, were inherently untrustworthy. If they saw an opportunity to cut Frank out and take over his supply chain, They'd do it without hesitation. And then there was the product itself. Frank tried not to think too much about the actual effects of what he was selling, about the lives destroyed by addiction, about the families torn apart, about the bodies of young men and women found dead in tenement apartments with needles in their arms. That kind of thinking was dangerous in his business. If you started really considering the human cost of what you were doing, you'd never be able to function. So Frank compartmentalized, separated the business of moving product from the reality of what that product did to people, and told himself that if he didn't sell it, someone else would. Which was true as far as it went, but didn't really address the fundamental moral equation. Bumpy had lived with that contradiction, had found ways to rationalize it or at least make peace with it. He'd been both destroyer and provider, both poison and protection, and Harlem had accepted him as both simultaneously. Now Frank occupied that same morally compromised position, wearing expensive suits bought with money that came from selling death in small plastic bags. By 1970, Frank Lucas was living a double life so complete that sometimes he wondered which version of himself was real. There was the Frank Lucas who attended church on Sundays with his mother, who drove a modest car and lived in a comfortable but unremarkable house, who presented to the world as a successful but not ostentatious businessman with interests in various legitimate enterprises. Then there was the other Frank Lucas, the one who controlled a heroin empire generating tens of millions of dollars annually, who'd built a smuggling network spanning 3 continents, who held the power of life and death over dozens of people, and exercised that power when circumstances required it. The funeral gesture had been about announcing his arrival, but maintaining his position required constant attention and occasionally brutal action. The drug trade attracted ambitious men the way blood attracted sharks, and Frank had to demonstrate repeatedly that he was willing and able to protect his territory. There were beatings delivered to dealers who tried to skim product or money. There were more severe punishments for those who threatened the integrity of his organization, informants found floating in the Hudson, competitors who disappeared without explanation, the kind of violence that sent messages even when no one actually witnessed it. Frank didn't enjoy violence the way some men in his business did. He didn't get a thrill from hurting people or demonstrating his power through cruelty, but he understood violence as a tool, as a necessary component of maintaining order in a business where written contracts couldn't be enforced and disputes couldn't be resolved in court. When someone needed to be hurt or killed, Frank made sure it happened efficiently and with minimum exposure to his organization. He'd learned from Bumpy that excessive violence attracted attention and destabilized the broader ecosystem. But insufficient violence invited challenges from people who mistook restraint for weakness. The money itself became a problem. Not having it, but dealing with the sheer volume of it. Cash arrived in such quantities that Frank needed entire apartments just to store it temporarily, rooms stacked floor to ceiling with bricks of 20s and 50s and hundreds wrapped in plastic. He employed accountants who did nothing but count money and devise laundering schemes, feeding cash through car washes and laundromats and nightclubs and record stores, creating paper trails that made it look like the money came from legitimate sources rather than from poison sold on street corners. He bought real estate, dozens of properties across New York and New Jersey, paying cash and using shell companies and nominees to obscure his ownership. He invested in legitimate businesses, becoming a silent partner in restaurants and retail stores, and even a small record label that actually turned a profit. The goal was to build a legitimate fortune that could survive, even if his drug empire eventually collapsed, to create a financial foundation that would support him and his family regardless of what happened with the heroin trade. His family, that was both his greatest vulnerability and his deepest motivation. Frank had brought his brothers up from North Carolina, giving them positions in his organization where they could earn serious money while being somewhat protect Ed from the most dangerous aspects of the business. He'd bought his mother a house, made sure she wanted for nothing, presented himself to her as a successful entrepreneur who'd made good through hard work and smart business decisions. She probably suspected the truth but chose not to examine it too closely. preferring the comfortable fiction that her son had found legitimate success in the city. But the funeral gesture and its aftermath haunted Frank in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd positioned himself as Bumpy's successor, had claimed the mantle of Harlem's premier drug lord, and now he was trapped in that role. He couldn't back down without appearing weak, couldn't retire without leaving a power vacuum that would tear Harlem apart, as various factions fought to replace him, couldn't even reduce his profile significantly without sending signals to his suppliers and competitors that he was losing his grip. The $100,000 buried with Bumpy had bought him access to an exclusive club, but the membership fees kept coming due, paid in stress and paranoia, and the constant knowledge that every decision could be his last. Frank started experiencing the occupational hazard of successful criminals. Deep existential paranoia. Was that new lieutenant really loyal, or was he an undercover cop? Were the Italians truly content with their arrangement, or were they planning to eliminate him and take over his supply chain? Was Detective Roberts getting close to something that LD bring down the entire organization? Roberts had indeed been getting closer. The detective had spent 3 years methodically investigating Frank's operation, building a case with the obsessive focus of someone who viewed criminals not as inevitable features of the urban landscape, but as problems that could be solved through determination and proper police work. Roberts had informants inside Frank's organization. Frank knew this because pieces of his operation occasionally got disrupted in ways that suggested inside information. He had surveillance photos, wiretap recordings, financial documents that traced some of the money flows. He was slowly assembling a prosecution that could send Frank to prison for decades. Frank knew he was being investigated. You didn't rise to his level without developing a sixth sense for police attention. But there was a difference between knowing in the abstract that cops were looking at you and understanding the specific details of how close they were to building a case. Frank paid informants inside the NYPD who provided some intelligence about Roberts's investigation, but Roberts was careful, compartmentalized his evidence, didn't share information widely within the department because he didn't trust his fellow cops not to tip off the targets. Beware, the pressure mounted through 1972 and into 1973. Frank's operation was at its peak, moving more product, generating more money, employing more people than at any point in its history. But he could feel the walls closing in, could sense that the